The 1980s, a decade of big hair, neon lights, and the unmistakable sound of crowds roaring as larger-than-life wrestling icons clashed in the ring. This was the era when pro wrestling became more than just a niche sport. It evolved into a cultural phenomenon that captivated millions. Whether you were tuning in to watch the latest showdown on cable TV or buying tickets to see wrestling live, the 80s marked the golden age of pro wrestling. This was my favorite era of wrestling. I know some will say the Monday Night Wars of the late 90s and early 2000s, which brought us the NWO and the Attitude Era, were the best, and I can't disagree with that. Those were great times in wrestling. However, I still cling to that special point in time when wrestling was about to explode and transform into a global phenom. In the 80s, that was what happened. Before the 80s, pro wrestling was largely regional, with different territories across the U.S., each having their own promotions and fan bases. The 80s changed all of that. This was the decade wrestling went mainstream. A new breed of wrestler was born, characters that were larger than life, both in and out the ring. The storylines became more elaborate, the matches more dramatic, and the wrestlers themselves became household names. Wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Ric Flair, just to name a few. What really set the 80s apart was the way wrestling began to integrate with pop culture. From music to movies, wrestlers were everywhere, blurring the lines between sports and spectacle. Anything seemed possible, and wrestling was the forefront of a cultural shift. I think what really put wrestling on the launch pad was the WWF's collaboration with MTV with the War to Settle the Score. It was amazing. And I mean, that was one of them things that was appointment TV. You did not miss that match. In the 80s, there were a lot of promotions that were out there. The key promotions, though, however, were undoubtedly the WWF. That was the most prominent promotion of the 80s. However, they were not the only game in town. The NWA and the AWA were also major players during this time, each with their own unique styles and fan bases. Now, I know there were other promotions that were out there. You had World Class Championship Wrestling, Georgia Wrestling, Memphis, Stampede, Florida. But let's face it, those three promotions, those were the top dogs. The NWA had been around since the 40s. It was a coalition of regional wrestling promotions that worked together to promote their talent. In the 80s, the NWA was known for its hard-hitting, realistic style of wrestling, which was stark contrast to the WWF. Ric Flair, one of the NWA's biggest stars, because let's face it, the NWA with his flamboyant style and ring ability, it just took off. Not to mention, there was a cool, they introduced us to the coolest faction of all time, the Four Horsemen. They were legendary. The AWA, on the other hand, was based in the Midwest and had a reputation of developing some of the biggest names in wrestling. Hulk Hogan got his start in the AWA before making the jump to the WWF. The WWF more or less pillaged the AWA. They took a lot of big names from this promotion. Not only did they take Hulk Hogan, they took Mean Gene Okerlund, Jesse Ventura, just to name a few. The AWA's focus was on technical wrestling with stars like Rick Martel and Nick Bockwinkel. It was amazing. All three of those federations competing, there's nothing like it. However, let's face it, the WWF is what launched wrestling to a new stratosphere. The vision of one Vince McMahon Jr. and his gamble on a little event called WrestleMania changed the landscape of wrestling forever. The WWF was king, and Vince McMahon was the Walt Disney of pro wrestling. Wrestling merchandise also exploded. In the 80s, everything was turned into a marketing opportunity. Wrestling was no exception. The 80s saw the birth of merchandise as a booming business, transforming wrestlers into brands and fans into walking billboards. Action figures, t-shirts, posters, trading cards. Hell, they even had the Hulkamania workout set. It was everywhere. The influence of the 80s wrestling on pop culture is still evident today, from the fashion to the catchphrases to the impact of that era to this era. It's just what made wrestling what it is today, and it will never be the same. The storylines were more than just plots. They were narratives that fans could invest in emotionally. The twists and turns kept audiences on the edge of their seats. wondering what was going to happen next. For fans of retro culture, the 80s is more than just a decade. It's a treasure trove of style, attitude, and innovation. So, as I look back on this era of pro wrestling in the 80s, it is clear that this was more than a sport. It was a cultural revolution. And like the music from the 80s, this part of wrestling history will never go out of style, in my opinion. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this retro blast from the past. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this content. And also, leave me a message. I do enjoy reading them. Let me know what you think about this era of wrestling. I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.